The slipspace rupture didn't announce itself the way the UNSC's finest minds had theorized it would. There was no gradual shimmer, no electromagnetic warning, no time to brace. One moment, the resolute Endeavor was punching through a Forerunner-generated slipspace corridor 3 clicks above a dormant halo ring, and the next, reality itself folded like a crushed aluminum can and spat them somewhere else entirely. Master Chief hit the deck of the frigate's observation bay as the ship groaned around him, a sound he'd learned to recognize as structural failure cascading through reinforced titanium. Through the viewport, stars he didn't recognize burned in configurations that matched nothing in his navigational memory. The slipspace portal behind them collapsed with a silent implosion, leaving nothing but scorched vacuum and the fading ghost of Forerunner mathematics. Cortana. Silence. Cortana, I need a sitrep. The neural link returned static. Not her absence. He knew her absence intimately, had carried it like a wound. This was different. This was interference, thick and wrong. Like something in the fabric of this space actively rejected the kind of ordered intelligence she represented. His HUD flickered, stabilized, then began pulling what data it could from external sensors. What it showed him stopped even a Spartan cold. The planet below was dying, not in the way Reach had died, quick, catastrophic, mercifully final. This world was dying slowly, the way old things die when something has been eating at them for decades. Continent-sized firestorms illuminated the cloud cover from beneath. Orbital debris fields, the skeletal remains of a naval engagement, drifted in lazy, catastrophic arcs, and threading through all of it, climbing from the surface in columns of black smoke that reached into the upper atmosphere, was evidence of a ground war of a scale he had never witnessed. Not Covenant, not Flood, something else, something older. The resolute Endeavor gave its last. The drives failed in sequence, the emergency klaxons ran their final cycle, and the hull began its death shudder. Master Chief was already moving, down corridors that listed at wrong angles, past the bodies of crewmen who hadn't survived the transit, toward the emergency deployment bay, where a single Pelican equivalent remained mag-locked and, against all probability, intact. He thought briefly of the 17 surviving crew members sheltering in the forward compartments. He thought of the beacon he'd already triggered, broadcasting on every frequency the ship's dying systems could manage. He thought about the math of survival, a calculation he'd run 10,000 times and never once enjoyed. Then he dropped into the pilot seat, punched the bay doors open against screaming atmospheric pressure, and flew the last bird off a dying ship. If you've ever wondered what it would look like when a force of pure tactical competence collides with the most complex, brutal, and self-defeating military civilization in human history, you're in exactly the right place. If you crave stories of impossible men in impossible wars, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark millennium. The Pelican sensors, damaged, intermittent, but functional, painted a picture as he descended through the cloud layer. The ground war beneath him was immense. Armies of men in olive green flak armor fought from entrenched positions behind walls of razored wire and prefabricated ferrocrete. Their weapons discharged in crimson beams that smelled, even through his filters, of ozone and desperation. Against them came something monstrous, hulking giants in Baroque armor the color of dried blood, their forms partially corrupted, partially mechanical, roaring in a language his translation matrices couldn't parse. Chaos Space Marines. He didn't have the name yet, but he recognized the shape of fanatical assault, the way they absorbed casualties without breaking, the way their officers drove them forward through sheer violent theology. He recognized something else, too. The Imperial line was collapsing. 3 kilometers of entrenched defense, held for what the scorch pattern suggested had been months, was folding in real time. A flanking force of the corrupted giants had breached the southern perimeter. 2 armored columns of Imperial tanks, massive angular things that looked like someone had built a cathedral and attached cannons, were burning. The soldiers falling back were doing so with discipline, but discipline only slows a rout. It doesn't stop one. Master Chief set the Pelican down in a supply depot 200 meters behind the main line, in the shadow of a collapsed manufactorum wall. He stepped out onto alien soil, gray-brown, thick with ash, reeking of promethium and copper, and took his first breath of the 41st millennium. His motion tracker lit up, 14 signatures, converging fast. They came around the manufactorum wall with weapons raised, laser guns he'd later learned to call them, and stopped dead when they saw him. 7 feet of olive green Mjolnir armor, visor polarized against the ash-filtered light, standing with the absolute stillness of something that had already calculated every angle of the situation and found none of them particularly threatening. A man in a long red coat and a face full of Gothic augmetic implants pushed through the soldiers. He wore the symbols of authority like other men wore scars, heavily and with evident pride. His single organic eye swept the chief from boots to helmet. His augmetic eye whirred and clicked as it took readings. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," the man said, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who expected the universe to organize itself around his declarations. "Identify yourself and explain what in the name of every saint that abomination of a vessel was." Master Chief looked at the burning line, looked at the routing soldiers, looked at the man in the red coat. "Later," he said. "Right now you have a southern flank that's gone. I need your best map of the terrain and whatever armor you have left. We can argue about who I am after we stop losing." The Inquisitor stared at him for a long, dangerous moment. Then, because the southern flank truly was gone, and he was a practical man beneath the theology, he pulled out a data slate and handed it over. Inquisitor Aldrich Voss had survived 37 years of service to the Ordo Hereticus by being precisely 2 things: ruthless and patient. He had outlasted demon princes, outwitted chaos cults that spanned entire subsectors, and once talked a rogue traitor out of selling an STC fragment to a Tau watercast diplomat through sheer force of ideological intimidation. He was not a man who was easily unsettled. The thing standing in his command tent, studying a tactical hololith with the focused intensity of a savant, unsettled him considerably. It hadn't introduced itself beyond a designation, Master Chief, UNSC, which meant nothing in any language Voss's considerable databanks recognized. It hadn't knelt. It hadn't invoked the Emperor. It had taken the data slate, absorbed the tactical layout in approximately 4 seconds, and then proceeded to issue a series of orders to Voss's own regimental commanders with the calm authority of a man who had been doing exactly this his entire life. The worst part was that the orders were correct. The southern breach had been plugged not by throwing bodies at it, the Imperial Guard's traditional solution, but by collapsing two parallel supply tunnels to create a choke point, redirecting a Lehman Russ squadron that had been sitting in reserve waiting for orders that never came, and positioning 3 sniper teams on the Manufactorum ruins to eliminate the Chaos officers driving the assault. Without leadership, the corrupted giants had slowed. Without momentum, they had stalled. Without a breakthrough, the flank had held. Voss had watched it happen from the command tent, in Vox traffic crackling with the voices of men who sounded, for the first time in weeks, like they believed they might survive. "You've commanded before," Voss said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Master Chief didn't look up from the hololith. "Where? Under whose authority? What chapter? What regiment? What fleet command?" "None that exist in your records." The chief finally looked at him, or at least the visor turned toward him, which produced the same effect. "I'm from somewhere else, a long way from here. The details are going to take time to explain, and right now your northern salient is undermanned." Voss clasped his hands behind his back. "I am an Inquisitor of the Holy Ordos. I have the authority to have you executed where you stand if I determine you represent a threat to the Imperium of man. I suggest you make time." A pause. Long enough that Voss began calculating whether his bolt pistol would actually penetrate that armor. "John," the chief said, "my name is John. I'm a soldier, the best my civilization produced. My civilization had gone from your reach, possibly forever. I came through something I don't fully understand and landed here in the middle of your war." He gestured at the hololith. "I can help you fight it. That's what I'm offering. What you do with the information after that is your business." Voss studied him for a very long time. The augmetic eye cycled through 17 different spectral analyses. No warp signature, no demonic taint, no psychic emanation of any kind, which was itself extraordinary, because everything that arrived through unexplained spatial phenomena carried some residue of the immaterium. This thing, this John, registered as aggressively mundane, a human being in very advanced armor, radiating nothing but competence and a faint trace of nitrogen-based coolant. "You are not a psyker," Voss said slowly. "No. You carry no blessings of chaos. Definitely not. You did not arrive through the warp. I don't know what the warp is, but whatever I came through, it wasn't religious." Voss almost smiled. Almost. Everything is religious in the 41st millennium. You'll learn that. He moved to a camp chair and lowered himself into it, with the careful dignity of a man whose augmetics had begun to ache in the cold. "Sit or stand, whatever your kind does, and tell me about this civilization of yours." What followed was 2 hours of the most operationally useful and theologically disturbing conversation Aldrich Voss had conducted in 3 decades of inquisitorial service. The man, and he was a man, baseline human genome with significant biological augmentation and mechanical enhancement, the Medicae Servitor had confirmed it, described a humanity that had reached the stars without the Emperor's light, that had fought alien threats without the protection of the Astronomicon, That had built artificial intelligence, abominable intelligence by any measure of the Mechanicus, and integrated it into their military command structure. Heresy, stacked upon heresy, wrapped in more heresy. And yet, the man himself displayed no corruption, no hunger for power, no theological error in his behavior. He simply operated from a completely different theological framework, one in which the universe was a problem to be solved rather than a war to be survived. He spoke of his enemies with clinical respect. He spoke of his losses with controlled grief. He spoke of leadership not as divine mandate, but as practical responsibility. It was, Voss reflected, possibly the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered, not because it was evil, because it was coherent. When the chief finished, Voss was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the guns had settled into their overnight rhythm, the slow, methodical exchange of fire that both sides maintained to remind the other they still existed. "I should report you to Terra," Voss said. "The correct procedure would be containment, study, and almost certainly termination." "I know," the chief said. "You're not going to." Voss raised an eyebrow. "What makes you certain?" Master Chief stood and moved back to the hololith. He highlighted 3 positions on the map with a gesture. Enemy supply lines, Voss realized, that his own staff had entirely missed. "Because you're a practical man," the chief said, "and your war isn't going well." Voss looked at the highlighted positions, looked at the man, looked at 37 years of survival instinct, which was screaming something complicated and important at him. "You will follow my authority," Voss said finally. "You will submit to regular examination by my staff. You will not attempt to communicate with any xenos entity, any chaos-aligned individual, or any unauthorized Imperial personnel without my knowledge." "Agreed, Hike, with one condition." "You don't get conditions. I don't follow orders that get people killed unnecessarily." The visor didn't waver. "That's not negotiable." The guns continued their slow conversation outside. Ash drifted through the tense ventilation seams. "Noted," Voss said quietly. "Welcome to the Imperium of Man. Try not to find it too disappointing." The planet was called Viridia Secundus, and it had been dying for 11 years. Master Chief learned this the way he learned most things in his first weeks in the 41st millennium, by listening more than he spoke, observing more than he acted, and filing everything into the tactical architecture of a mind that had been trained since childhood to treat information as ammunition. The chaos forces besieging the planet's primary hive city were a warband designated the Bleeding Word, a splinter of a larger traitor legion, whose theological particulars Voss's aides explained with the grim enthusiasm of men who had spent too long thinking about terrible things. They worshipped something called corn. They valued slaughter as liturgy. They had been grinding the Imperial defenders down for over a decade through sheer ecstatic attrition. 11 years, one planet, hundreds of thousands dead. He sat with that number in the quiet of the billet they'd assigned him, a converted manufactorum office, its walls still bearing the faded devotional murals of workers who hadn't survived to see the siege, and ran the math the way he always ran math. Not emotionally, not yet. First the numbers, then the weight. The Imperial Guard Regiment holding Viridia Secundus's northern district, The Cadian 114th had arrived with 12,000 soldiers. They currently fielded 4,200. Their equipment was aging. Their officers were exhausted. Their faith, and he was beginning to understand how load-bearing faith was in this military culture, was eroding in the particular way that faith erodes when it is asked to explain 11 years of unanswered prayer. He requested access to the full operational history of the siege. Voss's aide, a thin young man named Castellan Drevos, who had appointed himself the chief's reluctant guide to imperial military bureaucracy, produced 17 data slates worth of battle reports with the expression of someone handing over evidence of a crime. It was worse than he'd thought. Not because the soldiers were incompetent. They weren't. The Cadian 114th fought with a discipline and ferocity that would have earned his genuine respect in any context. It was worse because the strategy, if it could be called that, was purely reactive. Every decision made in 11 years had been a response to chaos pressure, never an initiative. Every resource allocation had prioritized holding ground over taking it. Every opportunity to break the siege had been declined in favor of waiting for reinforcements that never came. From a command structure so vast and slow, it apparently took years for requests to climb its hierarchy and seconds for denials to fall back down. The Imperium, he was beginning to understand, had confused endurance with strategy. He was still processing this when the Vox crackled and Voss's voice cut through. "Command tent, now. We have a situation." The situation had a name. Brother Captain Aldamos of the Storm Wardens, a Space Marine chapter whose heraldry Voss's aide identified with the slightly awed whisper of a man naming Saints. He stood at the center of the command tent, like a statue someone had forgotten to finish. 8 feet of blue-gray ceramite plate, a face carved from decades of war, and eyes that performed the same slow, analytical sweep of Master Chief that Voss's augmetic had, but with the added quality of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any given room. The eyes stopped, recalculated. "This is your anomaly," Aldamos said to Voss, not a question. "This is Master Chief. He's been attached to my staff as a tactical consultant. He is unaugmented." A pause. Largely. "His augmentations are of non-imperial origin," Voss said carefully. "We're still cataloging them." Master Chief stepped forward. "Brother Captain, I've read the siege reports. You've been rotating 2 companies through the eastern salient for 6 months. The enemy has adapted to your patrol cycles. You're losing 3 to 5 men per week to ambushes that shouldn't be succeeding against your capabilities." Aldamos turned the full weight of his attention onto him. It was, Master Chief acknowledged privately, a significant amount of weight. Space Marines, he had already determined, were the closest thing this universe had to Spartans, and in some physical respects, exceeded them. But physical capability wasn't the same as tactical thinking, and the reports had shown him patterns. You read the classified operational reports of an Adeptus Astartes company, Aldamos said slowly. "Voss gave me access. Your ambush problem is a scheduling problem. Vary the patrol timing by a randomized interval of 15 to 40 minutes each cycle. Change 2 of your 6 patrol routes weekly, and add a counter-ambush element that shadows each patrol at 200 meters. Your casualty rate drops to near 0. silence in the command tent, the kind of silence that has texture. "That is," Aldamos said carefully, "tactically sound." "I know." Another silence. Voss was watching both of them with the careful attention of a man who had placed an expensive and possibly unstable piece of equipment next to another expensive and possibly unstable piece of equipment and was waiting to see what happened. "Who trained you?" Aldamos asked. "People who understood that talent without method is just potential, and potential doesn't win wars." The brother captain studied him for a long moment. There was something working behind those eyes. Not hostility, exactly. More like the careful recalibration of a man whose categories had just been challenged. "The siege," Aldamos said finally. "You've reviewed the full history." "Yes, and?" Master Chief looked at the hololith. 11 years of reactive defense, mapped in light and shadow. Thousands of decisions, each individually reasonable, collectively catastrophic. "You've been trying to hold a position you should have been trying to escape," he said. "This isn't a siege, it's a trap. And the longer you treat it as a siege, the deeper the trap gets." Aldamos looked at Voss. Voss looked at his hands. Outside, Viridia Secundus continued its long, slow dying. "Show me," the brother captain said. "The plan took 72 hours to build and 40 minutes to nearly destroy." Master Chief worked through the first night on the hololith with Drevos feeding him data slates and Aldamos's 2 company commanders, Sergeants Verath and Call, both of whom had the particular quality of men who were excellent at executing orders and deeply suspicious of anyone who issued them differently than expected, asking sharp, precise questions that he answered with equal precision. By dawn of the second day, they had something that wasn't quite a battle plan and wasn't quite an escape route, but occupied the tactically useful space between the two. The core insight was simple, which was how he knew it was right. The Bleeding Word Warband wasn't besieging Viridia Secundus because they wanted the planet. They wanted the kill. Cornate theology. Drevos had explained it with the exhausted familiarity of a man who had spent years trying not to think about it, valued the act of slaughter above territory, resources, or strategic objectives. They had maintained the siege for 11 years, not because holding the planet served some larger strategic purpose, but because a siege that ground on indefinitely produced a continuous, reliable harvest of violence. It was, in its own horrifying way, efficient, which meant breaking it required denying them that harvest. Not fighting harder, fighting differently. The plan had 3 phases. First, a staged withdrawal from the northern district, executed in a way that looked like collapse, but was actually controlled compression, and drawing the Bleeding Word's forward elements into a kill zone around the Manufactorum district, where the terrain favored defenders. Second, a coordinated strike by Aldamos's Storm Wardens against the Warband's command structure. Not their strongest fighters, but their priests, their banners, their symbolic leadership, the scaffolding that held Cornati theology together in the field. Third, evacuation of the civilian population through a series of underground transit tunnels that the Bleeding Word had never located because 11 years of Imperial command had never thought to use them offensively. It was the third phase that nearly killed the plan before it started. The tunnel network ran beneath 6 kilometers of contested ground and connected to a void port on the planet's southern coast. Using it meant admitting that evacuation was the objective, that Viridia Secundus, at least this hive city, was being abandoned. When Voss relayed this to the regimental command structure, the response came back within the hour. Denied. Holding the city was a matter of imperial pride and theological significance. The governor's palace, still occupied by a governor who had reportedly not left his prayer chamber in 3 years, had been blessed by a passing cardinal. To abandon it was to abandon the emperor's light. Master Chief read the denial twice. Then he set it down on the table with the careful deliberation of a man exercising considerable restraint. "They'd rather lose the people than lose the ground," he said. "The Imperium does not abandon what the Emperor has claimed," Dravos said, and had the grace to look uncomfortable about it. "How many civilians are in this city?" A pause. "Approximately 400,000. He let that number sit in the air for a moment. "And the command structure that issued this denial, are any of them on this planet?" "No. The relevant authority is Segmentum Command, currently stationed at..." "So 400,000 people are going to die to satisfy a theological requirement issued by someone who isn't here and will never be here." Dravos opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That is a reductive characterization of, is it wrong?" Silence. It was Aldamos who spoke next, from the corner where he'd been listening with the stillness of a ceramite monolith. "The denial can be appealed. The process takes between 3 months and 2 years. We don't have 3 months. "No," the brother captain agreed. "We don't." What happened next was the moment Master Chief understood that the Imperium's greatest enemy wasn't chaos, or xenos, or entropy. It was itself. Because what Aldamos did, what this space marine, this instrument of the Emperor's will, this being who had dedicated every cell of his existence to a divine hierarchy, was look at a denial from Segmentum Command and make a practical decision. "The denial applies to the regiment," Aldamos said carefully. "The Adeptus Astartes operate under separate authority. If the Storm Wardens were to independently determine that tunnel reconnaissance was a military necessity, and if civilians were to coincidentally be directed toward those tunnels by parties unknown, Segmentum Command's denial of a formal evacuation order would remain technically unviolated." Master Chief looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very fine line," he said. "We are very precise warriors." It wasn't humor, exactly. But it was close enough that Voss made a sound that might, in better circumstances, have been a laugh. The plan was rebuilt around the new framework. It added complexity, but preserved the core. In the 48th hour, with both companies of Storm Wardens briefed, and the Cadian 114th's surviving officers brought into a version of the plan that emphasized tactical withdrawal without specifying its endpoint, Master Chief stood at the hololith and ran the final calculations. His ammunition reserves were finite. His armor's power cells would need field recharging within a week. Cortana's absence sat at the back of every calculation like a missing support strut. He kept reaching for analysis she would have provided instantly and finding only his own, slower thinking. He ran it anyway, checked it twice, found it sound. "Questions?" he asked the assembled officers. Sergeant Verath of the Storm Wardens raised a gauntleted hand. "When the northern withdrawal begins, the bleeding word will pursue. Our lines will be under maximum pressure. What will you be doing?" Master Chief picked up his MA5 and checked the magazine. 60 rounds. He'd need to find compatible ammunition eventually. For now, 60 would do. Making sure they follow, he said. He learned what it meant to be bait in the 41st millennium at precisely 0340 hours, when the bleeding word hit the northern perimeter with everything they had. They came the way Coronade warriors always came, without patience, without subtlety, without the tactical hesitation that made an enemy predictable and therefore manageable. They came as a tide of ceramic and corrupted flesh and screaming theology, chain axes igniting the pre-dawn dark. Their war cries in a language older than the Imperium, rattling the ferrocrete foundations of buildings that had stood for 3 centuries. They came because Master Chief had spent the previous 6 hours making himself visible, moving along the northern wall, drawing fire, responding with controlled bursts that were precise enough to sting and restrained enough to suggest a defender at the edge of his capabilities. In other words, he'd made them angry enough to stop thinking. The controlled compression worked, not cleanly. Nothing in real combat worked cleanly, and anyone who planned for clean had never stood in the middle of one. 2 Cadian squads broke early, panic overriding discipline when a chaos spawn the size of a warthog tore through their position. A section of the manufactorum wall that was supposed to hold for 40 minutes held for 12. Sergeant Verath's counter-ambush element ran into a roving pack of Coronat berserkers that hadn't appeared in any of the pre-battle scouting reports and spent 20 brutal minutes fighting clear of them. But the shape of it held. The bleeding word surged north into the kill zone, following the apparent collapse, following the damage reports, following, he suspected, the particular psychic scent of a battle going their way. Behind them, in the tunnels below the city's southern districts, the 400,000 civilians moved through darkness, guided by storm wardens who had determined, with precise military logic, that tunnel reconnaissance required civilian guides familiar with the underground geography. Master Chief held the manufactorum line for 90 minutes with 40 Cadian veterans and the absolute conviction that retreat was a tactic, not a failure. He fought differently than the soldiers around him, and they noticed. No prayers between engagements, just immediate reloading, position assessment, field of fire calculation. No rage, no fear response, no theological bargaining with a distant god. When a berserker twice his mass came through a collapsed wall section and covered the distance between them in 2 seconds of howling, blood-drunk momentum, the chief sidestepped with Spartan reflexes. I planted a combat knife in the joint between gorget and helmet and pivoted the body into the path of the warrior behind it. Clean, efficient, almost quiet. The Cadians watched him with an expression he recognized from a different lifetime. The look soldiers gave a Spartan when they first saw one work. Not quite awe. Something more complicated. The recalibration of what they'd believed was possible. He used it. Told them to watch his positioning, not his kills. Told them that ground was only worth holding until holding it stopped serving the mission. Told them things that sounded like tactical advice and were also, quietly, a different philosophy of war. One in which they were assets to be preserved rather than currency to be spent. At the 90-minute mark, he pulled them back. The bleeding word surged into the abandoned northern district, found nothing but empty streets and triggered demolition charges, and lost 600 warriors in the rubble of buildings that Master Chief had pre-designated for exactly this purpose. He was pulling back through the Southern Transit hub, last man through the checkpoint, when the Vox crackled with a voice he hadn't heard before. It wasn't Voss, it wasn't Aldamos. It was smooth, amplified, and carried the particular resonance of someone accustomed to being listened to by very large numbers of people. The anomaly put it through to me directly. A pause from Voss's aide on the other end. Then, "Yes, my lord." "Master Chief," the voice again. "I am Lord Militant Cassius Vrail, commanding the Ithacan Crusade. You have, in the last 4 days, done something that 11 years of Imperial command could not. I would like to discuss what that means for both of us." He kept moving through the transit hub, guiding the last Cadian squads toward the tunnel access points. Around him, the city was emptying, the slow, organized exodus of people who had been told only that safety lay south and that the soldiers were handling the rest. "I'm a little busy right now, Lord Militant." A sound that might have been surprise, possibly the first time in some years that anyone had said that to Cassius Vrail. "This is not a request. I know. Give me 4 hours. The city will be clear by then, and I'll have more time to talk." Another pause. Longer. "You intend to evacuate the entire civilian population of Viridia Hive." "Already happening." Segmentum Command denied that request. They denied a formal evacuation order. Nobody issued one. He stepped over a fallen ceiling beam, checked the tunnel entrance, waved the last squad through. "Your organization has a lot of rules. Some of them are very precisely worded." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he checked the Vox connection to make sure it hadn't dropped. 4 hours, Vrail said finally. "Then we speak, and Master Chief..." A weight entered the voice, something beyond rank, something that had been accumulating for a very long time. "I have spent 30 years trying to end that siege. I am aware of what 4 days of your presence has accomplished. I am also aware that such things do not happen without cost. When we speak, I will want to understand what you want in return." Master Chief descended into the tunnel, the sounds of the dying city fading above him. He thought about what he wanted. The answer was the same one it had always been. In every war, on every world, under every flag he'd ever carried. Fewer body bags on the way out. "We'll talk," he said, and cut the channel. Lord Militant Cassius Vrail was not what Master Chief expected, which meant he was exactly what he should have been suspicious of. He was old, not in the way Imperial commanders were old, bent under the weight of decades and augmetic replacement, but old in the way that power preserves certain men, keeps them sharp and dangerous, and perfectly aware of their own value. 70 years of Crusade command had carved his face into something architectural. He wore his rank like armor, and his intelligence like a weapon, and he received Master Chief in the strategium of his flagship, the Eternal Proclamation, an Emperor-class battleship whose scale made the resolute Endeavor look like a life pod. With the careful courtesy of a man who had already decided what he wanted and was working backward from that conclusion. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Vrail offered resources, authority, and the kind of formal recognition that, he explained with practiced understatement, would allow Master Chief to operate across the Ithacan Crusades theater of war without being shot by his own side. In return, he wanted what every senior commander wanted from an asset they couldn't fully understand or control: results, loyalty, and the appearance of institutional belonging. Master Chief accepted the resources, declined the loyalty, negotiated the appearance. It was the most political conversation he'd had since dealing with the Arbiter, and it left him with the same feeling: the particular unease of working alongside someone whose objectives overlapped with his own without ever quite aligning. He spent the transit to the Crusade's next operational theater learning, not from Vrail's staff, who told him what the Imperium wanted him to know, but from the ship's lower decks, where the Cadian survivors of Viridia Secundus had been billeted, and where men who had fought for 11 years spoke freely to someone who had stood on the same wall they had. What they told him built a picture that the official briefings carefully avoided. The Ithacan Crusade had been running for 30 years. It had reclaimed 63 worlds, lost 41, and was currently stalled on a broad front against a chaos incursion, whose scale and coordination suggested something beyond the usual fractious warfare of the Bleeding Word and its kindred warbands. There was a name being whispered in the lower decks, not in the briefings, and not in the strategium, the name of a chaos war leader who had reportedly unified 3 separate warbands under a single theological banner, a figure the soldiers called the Architect of Ruin. He filed it, asked more questions, listened harder. On the 4th day of transit, Drevos arrived at his billet with the expression of a man delivering news he'd spent considerable time rehearsing. "There is someone who wishes to speak with you," Drevos said. "Someone who is not officially present on this vessel." The someone was waiting in a sealed cargo hold in the ship's lower decks, in a space that smelled of incense and something older, something that registered in his peripheral awareness as a signal his biology wasn't designed to receive, but processed anyway, the way certain sounds exist at the edge of hearing. She was tall, and robed in the deep greens and blacks of someone who didn't want to be identified by color, and she moved with the liquid precision of a species that had been perfecting physical grace for 40 million years. Her ears came to elegant points. Her eyes were the color of deep space and held the particular quality of someone who was looking at him and simultaneously looking past him, through him, and approximately 600 years into his future. Eldar. He had the name from Voss's extensive and deeply prejudiced briefing materials. An ancient alien species, treacherous, manipulative, operating on timescales that made human strategic thinking look like children arguing over a sandpit. "Spartan," she said. The word carried inflection that suggested she'd encountered the concept before, which was impossible and therefore interesting. "I am Farseer Silera of Craft World Ulthway. I have been watching you since you fell through the wound in reality above Viridia Secundus. You've been on this ship the whole time. I have been adjacent to this ship. The distinction matters to your Inquisitor, who would have considerably more theological distress than is currently useful." A pause. "He will not find me unless I permit it." "What do you want?" She tilted her head. "The same thing you want in the immediate term." The Architect of Ruin stopped. "But my reasons are different from yours, and my methods are different from the Imperium's, and I think you are different enough from both to hear what I have to say without the usual species-level obstruction." He studied her. The motion trackers in his HUD registered nothing threatening in her posture. The threat assessment systems registered everything as threatening, which was their default state for xenos, and wasn't helpful. "Talk," he said. What she told him took an hour. She told it without the Eldar's reputed manipulation and elliptical indirection, told it straight, with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had calculated that he would respond better to directness than to theater. The architect of ruin was not simply a chaos war leader. He was a former Imperial Lord General who had turned to chaos not from corruption, but from a specific, documented disillusionment. A man who had spent 40 years fighting for an Imperium that consistently spent his soldiers like ammunition and discarded the planets he bled to reclaim the moment they became strategically inconvenient. His turn to chaos was theological, but its root was something Master Chief recognized with uncomfortable clarity. Rage at a system that treated human lives as expendable. "You're telling me this because you think I'll understand his motivation," Master Chief said. "I am telling you this because in 47 of the 63 futures I have walked, the architect of ruin attempts to recruit you." Solara's deep space eyes held steady. "And in 11 of those futures, he succeeds." The cargo hold was very quiet. "What happens in the other futures?" he asked. "In most, you destroy him. In a few, you destroy each other." A pause, precise as a surgical incision. "In 3, you do something none of my threads predicted. You change the shape of the war entirely, not by winning a battle, by refusing to fight the one everyone expects you to fight." He thought about that. You're about a former Imperial commander who had looked at the same system he'd been examining for weeks and reached a different conclusion. Not reform, but obliteration. And you're here because you want one of those 3 futures. I am here because 40 million years of survival has taught my people that the difference between a future worth having and one that ends everything is sometimes a single conversation, held at the right moment. She moved toward the cargo hold's far exit, a seam in the wall that hadn't been a seam before. "The architect will contact you. He will make arguments that are not entirely wrong. What you do with that conversation determines which thread we are standing in." She was almost through the wall when he spoke. "You said you'd encountered the word Spartan before." A pause. "The threads are long," she said, "and some wounds in reality leave echoes." Then she was gone, and the wall was a wall again, and the cargo hold smelled only of incense and the particular silence of something important having just happened. Master Chief stood in it for a long time. Then he went to find Voss. He told Voss about the Farseer. Not everything. Not the 11 futures where he was turned. Not the 3 where he changed the shape of the war. But enough. The xenos contact. The intelligence about the architect of ruin. The former Imperial Lord General, whose grievance was, stripped of theological dressing, a coherent critique of the system Voss had spent his life serving. He watched the Inquisitor's face carefully while he talked. Watched the theology and the practicality fight each other behind that single organic eye. Impracticality won, barely. The architect's name, Voss said, was Lord General Haran Solt. He commanded the Olverian front 20 years ago. lost 9 regiments in a single engagement because Segmentum Command redirected his orbital support to a politically prioritized theater without informing him. The men died on the ground, while the ships that could have saved them burned fuel 2 systems away. A pause. He was censured for the loss, not the command that caused it. Him. Master Chief said nothing. I investigated the case, Voss continued, quieter now. 7 years ago, concluded that the command failure was systemic and the censure was unjust. My report was filed, archived. Nothing changed. He looked at his hands. 3 months later, Solt disappeared from his penitent posting. 6 months after that, the Architect of Ruin appeared at the head of a unified Chaos warband on the Ithacan front. You knew. I knew the shape of it, not the certainty. Voss stood and moved to the viewport, where the Imperium churned beyond the Geller field in colors that had no business existing. The Imperium produces its own enemies with extraordinary efficiency. It is among its least acknowledged manufacturing capabilities. It was the most honest thing the Inquisitor had said in 6 weeks of honest statements, and it landed differently for that. With the particular weight of a man admitting something that cost him something to admit. What do we do with it? Master Chief asked. We find him before Vrail does. Vrail will exterminatus whatever world Solt is using as a base the moment he has confirmed coordinates. 400,000 civilians on Viridia Secundus, give or take. Whatever population Solt has accumulated around him. The organic eye found him. You understand what I'm telling you. You want him taken alive. I want him taken alive because dead martyrs are theologically useful to chaos and politically inconvenient to everyone asking how a Lord General became a chaos war leader on the Imperium's watch. A pause. And because I am an old man who has filed too many accurate reports that change nothing, and I would like, once, for the investigation to end differently. They had 11 days before the crusade reached its next operational theater. Master Chief spent them building 2 things simultaneously. A tactical framework for engaging the Architect of Ruin's unified warband, and a careful network of intelligence contacts drawn from the Cadian veterans, Vrail's less politically managed staff officers, and 2 rogue traders whose ships moved through the theater's outer systems and whose loyalty ran to profit rather than theology, which made them, paradoxically, more reliable. On the 8th day, the contact came, not through any channel he'd secured or expected. It arrived as a data burst embedded in the Eternal Proclamation's routine astropathic traffic. A single line of encoded text that used a UNSC encryption standard that hadn't existed in this universe until 4 weeks ago, when Master Chief had used it in a communication with Voss. Someone had been listening. Someone had learned the cipher from a single intercept and used it to say, I know what you are. I know where you came from. Meet me at the coordinates below, alone, and I will tell you what they will never tell you about the war you have inherited. Asterisk. He stared at the coordinates for a long time. Then he did something that surprised him. He showed it to Voss. The Inquisitor read it twice. He expects you to come alone. Yes. You're not going alone. I know, but I'm going. He met the organic eye. He used my encryption. That means he has access to signals intelligence at a level that suggests he's compromised something in this fleet. If I don't go, we learn nothing and lose the initiative. If I go with appropriate cover, We might end this without Vrail burning a world." Voss was quiet for a very long moment. "The coordinates are in the Kurath debris field. 3 days from our current position at a speed that doesn't register on the fleet's standard movement logs." He paused. "A single Thunderhawk running cold. Can you get one? I can get one." Another pause, longer. "Aldamos will want to come. Tell him he's the contingency, not the escort." The brother captain, when informed, produced a silence that somehow communicated profound disagreement without a single word. Then he nodded once and began preparing his contingency with the methodical thoroughness of someone who fully expected to use it. The Thunderhawk ran cold through 3 days of debris field navigation that required Master Chief to manually plot course corrections every 4 hours because the automated systems couldn't handle the interference. Voss slept in 4-hour intervals with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to rest in dangerous places. Drevos did not sleep at all and spent the transit composing what he quietly referred to as precautionary documentation, which Master Chief chose not to examine too closely. The coordinates resolved to a dead station, a void platform that predated the current crusade, its Imperial markings burned away, its power signature minimal and carefully managed. A single ship was docked at its exterior. Not a warship, a converted hauler, the kind of vessel that moved through contested space by being too unremarkable to shoot. They docked, moved through corridors that someone had recently cleaned and lit with portable lumens, an act of preparation that suggested the meeting mattered to the host. A Heron Solt was waiting in what had been the station's command center. He was smaller than Master Chief expected. Not physically diminished, he stood straight, moved well, carried himself with the residual authority of 40 years of command. But there was no chaos corruption visible, no mutation, no demonic enhancement. He looked like what he was, an old soldier who had made a catastrophic choice for comprehensible reasons and had been living in the consequences ever since. He looked at Master Chief for a long moment, then at Voss. Something moved across his face, recognition, perhaps, the slight adjustment of a man recalculating. "You brought the Inquisitor," Solt said, not accusatory, almost tired. "He brought himself," Master Chief said. "I didn't stop him." Solt nodded slowly. Fair." He moved to a battered tactical table and lowered himself into a chair with the careful movement of old injuries. "Sit or stand. I understand you prefer standing." He'd been watching longer than the encrypted message suggested. Master Chief filed it. "You said you'd tell me what they won't tell me about this war," he said. "Start there." Solt folded his hands on the table. "The architect of ruin is what they call me. I built it as a weapon, a unified force capable of threatening the crusade enough to force a negotiated boundary. Not a conquest, a ceasefire line. 40 worlds pulled back from the grinder, given time to recover, to rebuild populations that the Imperium has been bleeding for a century." He paused. "I turned to chaos for the resources. I did not turn to chaos for the theology. The distinction is one the Imperium is constitutionally incapable of recognizing. You're telling me you're not actually a chaos worshiper. I am telling you I made a transaction, power for purpose. The powers of chaos are not particular about the sincerity of their petitioners, only the usefulness." A long pause. "I am telling you this because in 6 months, possibly less, the transaction will come due. The powers will want what powers always want, not a ceasefire line, but a crusade in the opposite direction, and I will not be able to stop it alone. The command center was very quiet. Master Chief looked at a man who had looked at the same broken system he'd been examining for weeks and had chosen a different, worse, more understandable path than the one he was on. "You need someone to help you undo what you built," he said. "I need someone the Imperium will listen to when the alternative is presented." Solt's eyes, old and clear, and carrying the specific grief of a man who had been right about everything and lost anyway, found his. "I need someone who isn't already part of the machine." The negotiation lasted 14 hours. Not the kind of negotiation that happened across polished tables in fleet strategiums, with aides taking careful notes and lawyers parsing the theological implications of every clause. The kind that happened between four people in a dead station at the edge of a debris field, where the only record was memory, and the only witness was the cold of space pressing against the hull. Solt laid out his warband's composition, disposition, and the specific nature of the Chaos Compact he'd entered with a frankness that made Voss's augmetic eye cycle through 17 expressions in approximately 4 minutes. 3 warbands, unified under the architect's banner through a combination of genuine military authority and chaotic investiture. The former providing discipline, the latter providing the kind of battlefield enhancement that kept his soldiers alive against Imperium forces that would otherwise outgun them. The compact's terms, as Solt understood them, were structured around continuous military action. Sustained aggression fed the powers. A ceasefire starved them, which meant the window for dismantling the arrangement without catastrophic backlash was narrow, specific, and closing. "How narrow?" Master Chief asked. 30 to 40 days. After that, the invested warriors begin exhibiting compulsive aggression that overrides command authority. I lose control of the warband from the inside. Solt's hands were steady on the table. It has happened to others who attempted similar transactions. I have studied the failure modes carefully, and you need the Imperium to offer terms within that window. I need the Imperium to offer terms that give my soldiers somewhere to go. Amnesty for the non-invested, penitent deployment for the partially corrupted. The 40 worlds on the ceasefire line administered as recovery zones rather than reclamation targets for at least one Imperial generation. He paused. I am aware of how this sounds. It sounds like something Vrail will never accept, Voss said. Vrail is not the relevant authority. Solt looked at Master Chief. You are. He absorbed that. I'm not Imperial command. No, but in 8 weeks you have become something the Imperium hasn't produced in living memory. A military figure whose results are so unambiguous that the system cannot easily dismiss them without dismissing itself. Vrail needs your continued cooperation more than he needs his pride. A pause. And you are not from here. You carry none of the theological baggage that makes compromise impossible between Imperial factions. You can propose what no Imperial officer could propose without being labeled a heretic. It was, Master Chief acknowledged privately, not wrong. It was also the most dangerous kind of correct, the kind where the logic was sound and the implementation would be catastrophic. If I take this to Vrail, he said, There are three possible outcomes. He accepts the terms, which I estimate at less than 20% probability. He rejects them and exterminates the worlds in question, which I estimate significantly higher. Or he agrees nominally and uses the negotiation window to position forces for a decisive strike. He paused, which is what I would do in his position. Solt nodded slowly. Yes. So we need leverage. Yes. What leverage does a Chaos War leader have against an Imperial Lord militant that doesn't involve threatening Imperial lives? Solt reached into his coat and produced a data crystal, the kind used for high-security archival storage, its casing marked with Mechanicus authentication seals. He set it on the table between them. 20 years of documentation, he said. 40 engagements where command failures caused preventable mass casualties. 19 instances of segmentum command redirecting critical resources for political reasons while soldiers died for the lack of them. 7 cases where my own official reports were falsified in the central records to obscure accountability. A pause. And 4 instances directly implicating Vrail's command tenure in decisions that, under the Lex Imperialis, constitute criminal negligence resulting in mass military death. Voss was very still. You kept records, the Inquisitor said quietly. All this time. I am a Lord General, Solt said, with the ghost of something that had once been professional pride. I kept records of everything. It was the one habit they never managed to break. He looked at Voss with an expression of careful, precise hope. An Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus, with authenticated documentation of this scope, could compel a hearing, could force accountability structures that have never been applied, could make the case that the conditions producing renegade commanders are themselves a threat to the Imperium's integrity. Could also get himself killed, Voss said. Yes, that too. The dead station creaked around them, thermal expansion in the debris field shadow, the sound of old metal adjusting to cold. Master Chief looked at the data crystal, looked at Solt, looked at Voss, who was looking at 37 years of careful survival and whatever it had been protecting him for. This is the plan, Master Chief said. It wasn't a question. He was mapping it as he spoke, the way he'd always mapped things, tactically, sequentially, identifying the points of maximum friction. Voss takes the documentation, files it through proper inquisitorial channels in a way that makes suppression more costly than compliance. Simultaneously, I present Vrail with the ceasefire proposal as a military recommendation. Frame it as strategic consolidation, not negotiation with a Chaos War leader. Give him a version he can accept without theological compromise. He paused, and Solt begins quietly dissolving the compact from within before the 30-day window closes. The third element is the most dangerous, Solt said. Dissolving the compact requires specific ritual negation. There's a chaos priest in my warband, a man called the Suture, who manages the invested warrior's theological maintenance. Without his cooperation, the negation fails. Can he be convinced? A long pause. He was, before the compact, an imperial missionary, a man of faith who followed my warband into the wilderness because he believed soldiers needed spiritual care regardless of their allegiance. Solt's voice carried something careful and old. He has not yet fully become what the compact is making of him, but the window for reaching him is the same as the window for everything else. Master Chief looked at the debris field beyond the viewport, the drifting bones of ships that had fought and died in wars whose names he didn't know, for causes that had made sense to someone once. "I'll talk to him," he said. Both Voss and Solt looked at him. "You," Voss said carefully, "want to go into a Chaos Warband's command structure and have a theological conversation with a partially corrupted missionary priest. I want to find out if he can be reached. That's a different thing from a theological conversation." He picked up the data crystal and turned it in his gauntleted hand. "I've talked people back from worse edges than this." He thought of the Arbiter, of Johnson, of every moment in a long life of war where the right conversation at the right moment had changed what the shooting was for. "The Suture's name," he said to Solt, "and how to reach him." Solt studied him for a long moment with those old, clear eyes that had seen 40 years of a war that ate people and called it sacred. "Marin," he said quietly. "His name is Marin, and he responds to honesty. It is, in this context, the rarest thing anyone has offered him." They left the dead station 4 hours later. The data crystal secured in Voss's coat and a set of coordinates for the Warband's secondary staging ground, loaded into the Thunderhawk's navigation system. The debris field moved around them in its slow, ancient orbit, indifferent to the specific weight of what had just been decided. Drevos, who had spent the entire 14 hours composing precautionary documentation and pretending not to listen, waited until they were 3 hours clear of the station before speaking. "I want it noted," he said carefully, "that I have serious reservations about every element of this plan." "Noted," said Voss. "I want it noted that I intend to participate in it anyway." "Also noted," a pause. "I've updated my precautionary documentation to reflect the new operational parameters." Master Chief looked at him. "What does the documentation say?" Drevos straightened slightly. "That if this works, it was a brilliant and unorthodox application of inquisitorial authority. And if it doesn't, I was under duress the entire time." It was, Master Chief reflected, probably the most honest thing anyone in the Imperium had said to him since he'd arrived. The Suture was praying when Master Chief found him. Not the frantic, blood-soaked devotion of Coronati theology. Not the screaming liturgy of men who had traded faith for fury. He was kneeling in the corner of a converted cargo bay at the heart of the Warband staging ground, hands folded, head bowed, murmuring something in low Gothic that Master Chief's translation matrices parsed slowly, word by word, into the shape of a man asking forgiveness from something he wasn't sure was listening anymore. Getting here had cost 3 days and 1 significant firefight. The Warband's outer perimeter had not been informed of the arrangement Solt had quietly communicated through his most trusted lieutenants, which meant Master Chief had spent 40 minutes navigating a partially invested Coronate security cordon, using a combination of Solt's authentication codes, aggressive misdirection, and, at one unavoidable juncture, a corridor fight against 4 Chaos Warriors that he'd conducted in near silence with a combat knife, and the particular efficiency of someone who understood that noise was a tactical liability. He'd taken 2 hits. His shields had absorbed them. His ammunition reserves, already finite, were now critical. He noted it, filed it, and kept moving. The staging ground was a hollowed-out asteroid, a temporary facility, deliberately impermanent, The kind of base a man built when he knew everything he was constructing might need to be abandoned quickly. It told him something important about Solt's state of mind. The Lord General had never stopped thinking about the exit. Even in his worst choices, he'd preserved optionality. It was, Master Chief thought, the mark of a genuine commander buried under everything else the man had become. The cargo bay smelled of incense and ozone and something older. The particular scent he'd started to associate with chaos proximity, a wrongness at the edge of olfactory processing that his Spartan biology registered as threat without being able to specify direction. He stood in the bay entrance and watched Marin pray and gave him 30 seconds to finish. The missionary was a broad man, built like someone who had worked physically hard for decades before the physical work changed in nature. His robes were imperial in origin, patched and repatched until the original fabric was mostly memory. The corruption was visible, but not advanced. A slight iridescence to the skin at his temples, a faint wrongness to the shadow he cast in the cargo bay's lumen light. The window Solt had described was real. He was close to the edge but hadn't gone over it. "You're not one of mine," Marin said without turning around. "No. You're not chaos either. The feeling is different." He rose slowly with the careful movement of a man whose knees had been on hard floors for too long. When he turned, his eyes, still mostly human, still carrying something that recognized itself as faith, moved across the Mjolnir armor with an expression that cycled through confusion, theological alarm, and something that settled, surprisingly, into curiosity. "What are you?" "A soldier from somewhere else." Master Chief moved into the bay, put his back to a bulkhead, watched the entry points. "Harren Solt sent me." Something shifted in the missionary's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a door opening onto a room he'd stopped believing was there. "He told you my name. He told me you were a man of faith who followed soldiers into the wilderness because you believed they needed spiritual care, regardless of their allegiance." He paused. "I'm here to find out if that's still true." Marin was quiet for a long moment. He moved to a battered crate and sat on it with the weariness of a man carrying something heavy that had been getting heavier for a long time. "What Harren wants," he said carefully, "requires ritual negation of a compact that has invested 60 warriors with energies that will resist dissolution. The process is painful, possibly fatal to some of them, and it requires me to actively work against the powers I have been—" He stopped, started again. "The powers I have been in proximity to." Proximity isn't the same as worship. "In the 41st millennium," Marin said quietly, "the difference is smaller than you'd think." Master Chief crouched to bring himself closer to eye level, a deliberate choice. The kind of physical adjustment that communicated something words sometimes couldn't. "Tell me about the men you've been caring for, not the invested ones. The others." A pause. Then, slowly, Marin talked. He talked about the non-invested soldiers in Solt's warband, men who had followed a commander they trusted into exile and found themselves in a war they hadn't signed up for, sustaining faith injuries that conventional imperial theology had no framework for treating. Men who felt abandoned by the Emperor, not because they'd rejected him, but because every institution that claimed to represent him had failed them so comprehensively that the failure felt theological. men who prayed in secret because praying openly in a chaos warband was a survival liability, and who came to Marin in the dark because he was the only one who still held the forms of something they'd lost. He talked for 20 minutes. Master Chief listened to all of it. "You've kept them human," Master Chief said when Marin finished. "In the worst possible environment, you've kept 200 men from becoming what the invested ones are becoming. That's not nothing. It's not enough. No, but it's the foundation." He held the missionary's gaze. "The negation ritual. Walk me through what it requires." Marin did. It was complicated, dangerous, and dependent on a specific sequence of actions that needed to be coordinated with Solt's command authority and executed within a window that was now, by his calculation, 17 days wide. The ritual itself would take 6 hours. The aftermath would be chaotic. Invested warriors experiencing forced theological withdrawal, the process Marin described with the careful clinical language of someone who had witnessed it once before and was still processing what he'd seen. "The risk to you specifically," Master Chief said. Marin looked at his hands. The iridescence at his temples caught the lumen light. "Significant. Ritual negation at this proximity to a chaos compact creates what the older texts call a backlash event. The energies being dissolved have to go somewhere." He paused. "In the historical records Heron found, the officiant of the negation absorbs a disproportionate share. Fatally? In 3 of the 4 documented cases, yes." The cargo bay was very quiet. Master Chief thought about what he was asking. Not abstractly, concretely, with the specific weight that came from a lifetime of sending people into situations where the math of survival wasn't in their favor. He thought about Marin's 30 seconds of prayer and what a man was still hoping for when he prayed in a place like this. "What were you asking forgiveness for?" he said. "When I came in." Marin looked up. The question had caught him somewhere unguarded. "For still being here," he said finally. "For not having found a way to undo this sooner. For every day I spent telling myself that staying was serving the men when part of me was staying because I was afraid of what leaving meant." A long pause. "For knowing what the right thing was and finding reasons not to do it." Master Chief stood. "The right thing has a 17-day window. After that, it becomes much harder." He moved toward the cargo bay entrance. "I need 24 hours to coordinate the external elements. Solt will signal you through the usual channel when we're ready to move." "And if the backlash kills me?" He stopped at the entrance, turned back. "Then you'll have done the right thing," he said. "That matters, even when it's the last thing." It wasn't comfort exactly. He'd never been good at comfort, had always been better at truth, even when truth was hard. But Marin nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who had needed truth more than comfort for a very long time, and was finally receiving the right currency. The return journey through the asteroid was faster. The security cordon had rotated. The authentication codes still held, and he moved through the corridors with the efficient urgency of someone running against a clock that had always been running. He was 200 meters from the extraction point when the Vox in his helmet crackled with a signal that wasn't Voss, wasn't Solt, wasn't any frequency he'd authorized. It was Vrail. "Master Chief," the Lord Militant's voice carried something new. not the careful authority of their first conversation, but something tighter, more dangerous. I have become aware of your current location. I have become aware of your general intentions. A pause with weight in it. I have 40 ships positioned at the edge of this system. I want you to explain, very carefully, why I should not resolve this situation with the tools I have available. He kept moving toward the extraction point. Because you need what I'm building more than you need the satisfaction of burning it, he said. That is an extraordinary claim. I have extraordinary evidence. He reached the extraction bay, saw the Thunderhawk waiting, saw Drevis's pale face at the viewport. Give me 72 hours, Lord Militant. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing but time. If I'm right, you end a 30-year war without losing another regiment. The silence on the channel lasted long enough that he was boarding the Thunderhawk before Vrail spoke again. 72 hours, the Lord Militant said. Not 73. The Thunderhawk launched cold into the asteroid field, running dark, carrying the weight of 17 days and everything that had to happen inside them. Master Chief pulled up the tactical display and began building the final sequence. It was, he reflected, the most complicated operation he'd ever planned. More moving parts than Reach, more political variables than the Ark, more riding on a single missionary's willingness to do the right thing than any equation he'd ever trusted to a single human factor. He ran the numbers anyway, found them, if not clean, then possible. Possible had always been enough. The 17 days collapsed into something that felt, in the living of them, like both an eternity and no time at all. Voss filed the documentation through 3 separate inquisitorial channels simultaneously, a redundancy that Master Chief had insisted on after calculating that single-channel submission created too many points of interdiction for parties motivated to suppress it. The data crystal's contents, authenticated by Mechanicus seals that predated the Crusade, and therefore fell outside Vrail's political reach, detonated through the Ordo Hereticus's internal networks with the contained violence of a shaped charge. Not an explosion that destroyed everything, an explosion that opened a specific door. Vrail received the ceasefire proposal on day 3. Master Chief presented it in person, aboard the Eternal Proclamation, in the Lord Militant's Strategium, with Aldamos standing against the far wall in the carefully neutral posture of someone who had strong opinions and had agreed, provisionally, to keep them holstered. He presented it not as negotiation with a chaos war leader, but as strategic consolidation of a 30-year front, a military recommendation backed by tactical analysis, showing that the current operational tempo was unsustainable, that the Crusade's attrition rate projected complete combat ineffectiveness within 6 years, and that a negotiated boundary line secured now would free 3 full army groups for redeployment to theaters where the strategic return was measurably higher. He used numbers. He used projections. He used the language of military logic rather than the language of mercy, because mercy was a theological concept that Vrail's framework processed as weakness, and weakness was a door that closed before you reached it. Vrail listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he sat with it for 2 days. On day 5, he sent back 17 objections, each precisely worded, each representing a genuine strategic concern rather than reflexive rejection. Master Chief answered all 17. Vrail sent 9 more. Master Chief answered those too. On day 8, the Lord Militant summoned him to the Strategium and told him, with the careful precision of a man dismantling his own pride 1 brick at a time, that provisional acceptance was possible, contingent on terms he then outlined over 4 hours. They were hard terms, not impossible ones. Master Chief took them to Solt through a channel Voss had established. Indirect, deniable, operating through the rogue traders whose loyalty to profit had made them useful across the entire operation. Solt accepted 12 of the 19 conditions without modification, proposed alternatives for 5, and rejected 2 outright, with reasoning that Master Chief relayed back to Vrail verbatim because the reasoning was sound, and he'd decided early that this negotiation would only work if both sides were occasionally told things they didn't want to hear. Vrail, to his credit, accepted one of the 2 rejections, referred the other to a subcommittee that would almost certainly argue about it for years. In the Imperium, Master Chief had learned, referring something to a subcommittee was the institutional equivalent of letting it go. On day 11, Marin performed the negation ritual. Master Chief wasn't there. The extraction logistics had required him elsewhere, coordinating the movement of Solt's non-invested soldiers toward the processing points that Voss had quietly arranged through his inquisitorial authority. But Solt was there, and 2 of the Lord General's most trusted lieutenants, and 60 invested warriors who had been told only that what was happening was necessary, and that the man performing it had chosen to do so freely. The backlash event lasted 3 hours by Solt's account, delivered afterward in the flat, careful voice of a man reporting something he intended to remember accurately. The invested warriors experienced forced theological withdrawal in sequence, not simultaneously, which Marin had calculated would be fatal to most of them, but staged, the ritual pulling the chaotic investiture out in threads rather than tearing it free entire. The process was, by every account, extraordinarily painful. None of the 60 died. Several would carry physical marks of the withdrawal permanently. Marin absorbed the backlash for 6 hours after the ritual concluded. He survived, barely, and with consequences that Solt described with the careful grief of a man cataloging a debt he knew he could never repay. The iridescence at the temples was gone. In its place was something that the Lord General, who had not used imperial theological language in 20 years, described without apparent self-consciousness as grace. A quality in the missionary's eyes that suggested a man who had gone to the edge of something and come back changed in a direction nobody had predicted. On day 15, the first of Solt's non-invested soldiers passed through imperial processing under the amnesty framework Voss had structured. They were frightened, exhausted, and carried the particular psychological profile of men who had spent years in proximity to something that wanted to consume them. The Mechanicus screened them. The Ministorum prayed over them. The Inquisition documented them with the thoroughness of an institution that trusted nothing but kept records of everything. They were, by every measurable standard, human beings who had made terrible choices for understandable reasons and had been given, for once, something the Imperium rarely offered to anyone: a way back. On day 17, the ceasefire line was formally established. Not celebrated. The Imperium didn't celebrate ceasefire lines. which it categorized as temporary operational pauses rather than achievements, but established, marked on maps, communicated to relevant commands through the laborious channels of imperial bureaucracy, which would spend years arguing about the theological implications of the decision, while the decision itself quietly saved lives. Harren Solt did not receive amnesty. He had been explicit about this in the negotiations, had in fact refused it with a directness that had surprised everyone, including Master Chief. What he had done could not be undone by paperwork, he'd said. The compact had been entered. The Chaos powers had been served, however reluctantly. The men who had died on both sides of the Architect of Ruins campaign were dead regardless of the motivation behind the campaign. An amnesty would be a lie told to make the institution feel better about a complicated outcome. Instead, he had requested something different, a formal inquisitorial investigation into the command failures that had preceded his turn. Not to excuse what he'd done, to ensure it couldn't happen to the next Lord General who filed an accurate report and received a censure in return. Voss had accepted the request with the expression of a man who had been waiting 37 years for someone to ask him to do exactly this. Solt was in inquisitorial custody when Master Chief last saw him. Not imprisoned, precisely, but confined to the investigation process that Voss had initiated, and a process whose scope was already expanding beyond the original documentation in ways that were making several senior figures in Segmentum Command extremely uncomfortable. He looked tired and precise, and entirely at peace with the specific consequences he'd chosen. "You got what you wanted," he said to Master Chief through the security field of the holding facility. "Most of it." "What didn't you get?" Master Chief thought about it honestly. "A system that doesn't produce the next Harren Solt. That's going to take longer than 17 days. The old Lord General almost smiled. "Longer than your lifetime, probably. Longer than mine." He paused. "But you moved it, a fraction, in the right direction." He looked at the Spartan with those clear, exhausted eyes. "In the 41st millennium, that is not a small thing." It wasn't. Master Chief understood that now in a way he hadn't when he'd first stood on the ash-covered ground of Viridia Secundus and looked at a routing army and made a calculation about what was worth doing. The scale of this universe was incomprehensible. 1,000,000 worlds, 10,000 years of unbroken war, systems of faith and bureaucracy and violence so deeply entrenched they had become indistinguishable from the laws of physics. No single soldier, however well trained, however well armored, however fortunate, could fix it. But a single soldier could hold a line, could plan a withdrawal that saved 400,000 people, could sit in a dead station with an old general and an inquisitor and build a 17-day framework that ended one piece of one war without burning a world to do it, could move things a fraction, all in the right direction. On the 18th day, Vrael summoned him to the Strategium and offered him a formal position within the Crusade's command structure. A role with genuine authority, genuine resources, and the kind of institutional recognition that would allow him to operate across the theater without navigating each engagement as an anomaly that needed explaining. He accepted, with conditions. Vrael, who had spent 2 weeks learning what Master Chief's conditions looked like in practice, accepted the conditions without significant argument. He was, beneath the theology and the rank, a practical man who had just watched an impossible outcome get built out of honest conversations and careful timing, and practical men update their models when the evidence is sufficiently unambiguous. The position came with a title that the Imperium's bureaucracy had apparently invented specifically for him. A designation so convoluted in its formal Gothic phrasing that Drevos had needed to explain it 3 times before Master Chief understood that it essentially meant the person who does what needs doing when what needs doing doesn't fit existing categories. He thought that was probably accurate. Aldamos found him on the observation deck of the Eternal Proclamation on the 19th day, standing at the viewport looking out at a galaxy that was still, by any reasonable measure, catastrophically broken. The brother captain stood beside him in companionable silence for a while, a quality Master Chief had come to appreciate in the Space Marine. This ability to be present without requiring the presence to mean something immediately. "The chapter master will want a full account," Aldamos said eventually. "I know. He will have theological objections to several of your methods." "I know that too." A pause. "He will also, I think, find them difficult to argue with." Another pause. Longer. "You fight like an Astartes, not in the physical sense, in the sense that matters more." He turned slightly, and the weight of that consideration landed the way Aldamos's considerations always landed, with the full force of someone who did not say things carelessly. "You fight like someone who understands what the fight is for." Master Chief looked out at the stars, at the million worlds burning and enduring, and fighting and failing, and occasionally, against all probability, surviving. He thought about Cortana's silence, about the crew of the Resolute Endeavor, most of whom had not made it through the dimensional transit, about every war he'd ever fought, and what it had cost, and what it had preserved, and whether the calculus had ever, in the final accounting, come out clean. It never did. That wasn't the point. The point was the fraction, the right direction, the 17 days that hadn't existed until someone decided to build them. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I do." The stars burned on, indifferent and vast, the way they always had and always would. Somewhere in the Imperium, powers older than humanity stirred and schemed and waited for the next opportunity. Somewhere on 40 reclaimed worlds, populations were beginning the slow, uncertain work of recovery. Somewhere in an inquisitorial holding facility, an old general was giving testimony that would make powerful people uncomfortable for a very long time. And somewhere in the 41st millennium, a soldier from a universe that no longer existed was learning, one impossible problem at a time, what it meant to fight a war that never ended, and why that was, against all logic and evidence, still worth doing. Master Chief had fought the flood across the width of a galaxy. He had watched Reach burn and held the line anyway. He had stood at the edge of the universe's destruction and done the math and decided that the math was worth doing. None of it had prepared him for the 41st millennium. Not because it was harder, though it was in ways that resisted simple measurement. Not because the enemies were worse, though some of them were, in ways that challenged even a Spartan's capacity for clinical threat assessment, but because the 41st millennium was a place that had decided 10,000 years ago that survival was the only victory available, and had built everything, its theology, its institutions, its identity, around that decision. A civilization-scale adaptation to despair, so total and so ancient that it had forgotten it was an adaptation. What Master Chief had brought to it wasn't a superweapon, wasn't divine providence, wasn't the kind of singular heroism that imperial propaganda required its champions to embody. He'd brought a different assumption, that the war was winnable, not today, not in one campaign, not by one soldier, but winnable, incrementally, fractionally, one honest conversation and one carefully planned withdrawal and one 17-day window at a time. Whether the Imperium could absorb that assumption without destroying it remained the open question. Powerful institutions had powerful immune responses to ideas that challenged their foundations. There were enemies he hadn't made yet, investigations that would create friction, a subcommittee that was going to argue for years. But the ceasefire line held. The worlds recovered. Marin prayed in a language that was his own again, and a soldier from somewhere else kept moving forward, because forward was the only direction that had ever made sense. The Emperor protects, but sometimes he sends help from somewhere unexpected. The Emperor protects. More stories await.